Welcome to Season 4 of the Knack for Business podcast.
Question of the audience. How do you stop being invisible and use your voice to actually bring in more clients? That's exactly what Hector will unpack, how podcasting helps business owners build authority, create authentic connections, and keep their pipeline full. If you've been wondering how to stand out in a crowded market, tune in as Hector shares the strategies that turn your story into sales. Our guest today is Hector Santistaban from Amplafy, founder and CEO of Amplafy Media. He's started this business and it's a podcast production company. He launched 9 years ago to help business owners turn their expertise into growth. A self-described nerdy, not quite jacked single dad, Hector has jumped into live streaming back in 2015 and has helped voices stand out ever since. Hector, it's an absolute pleasure having you here today. Thank you so much for being here. And do you have your favorite quote or saying, sir?
Yeah, it's by Emil Coué, and it's every day in every way we're getting better.
Perfect. Very perfect. So what pulled you into podcasting? I mean, you could have done YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Maybe not 2015 TikTok wasn't the dance craze then, but what brought you into podcasting?
What started even earlier than that, I remember back, I think it was the 97, 98 Super Bowl. John Elway he had just won his last Super Bowl and he was retiring. And I remember all of my family sitting around the TV watching him talk at the press conference, right? They weren't even watching the game. They were listening to him talk at the press conference. And people were glued to the screen. And that stuck out to me. And at that moment, I was like, oh, I want to be a football player. Little did I know I'd turn up and be like 5'6", and, I'd try and get to 170 pounds as much as I can eat. And so that wasn't, that wasn't in the cards for me as much as I tried. But as I sort of reflected on it, and I went to school and got a marketing degree and, went down my path of, entrepreneurship and like all these sort of things, I realized that what I really saw was that he had a platform, that because he played this sport, people listened to him, that he had this authority, he had this expertise, and people were listening to him about leadership, and they were listening to him about resilience, and they were almost asking questions about life that from this quarterback, and that for me really stood out, and that was almost 30 years ago. And so fast forward to 2015, I was getting out of the sales world and I was about to have my first child, and I was spending 60, 70 hours a week at the office. And I knew that wasn't going to be conducive to the lifestyle and being the parent that I wanted to be. And so I started reading all these books and started going into, looking at all these options, and blogging was sort of this thing, and Instagram had just came out, and Facebook, it was actually right when Facebook allowed Facebook Live. They just launched their first, that first feature for the first time. And so I just sort of saw that, someone told me that if I just talked, people might listen. And I was like, let me try this. And I was in my room in my office, and I hit the go live button, and people started to listen, and people started to show up. And it was back then, and even today, you could still see how many people are tuning in live. I remember one day it was 1, and then it was 3, and then it was like 7, and then more and more people just kept showing up. So I just kept talking, and the market sort of evolved, and live streaming went its way, and it's coming back. It's having this sort of resurgence recently, but podcast emerged as this thing that anybody could do, and if you were new in the business world and you were new in the industry, it was something that could establish you sort of right away. And if you were really established with the industry, or you had a lot of experience, it's something that could really cement that or take that to another level. And so for me, I sort of have a business and sales background, and I also live in Southern California, where rent is due every month, and so I had to find a way to sort of make it make sense, dollars and cents. And so for me, business owners, and there's a lot of business leaders who they started back before the internet was a thing, right? They built most of their network, most of their connections, and most of their sort of their business before the internet was a thing. And now all of a sudden, 10 years later, we look up and you sort of have to be where people are in order to compete with the TikTokers or the Instagrammers or the YouTubers, because a lot of those people are coming around and they have a tenth of the experience that some of these other business leaders have. but they're getting 10 times the business because more people are aware of them.
There's something you say that I think is both a good truth and a great marketing thing, but I'd love you to clarify. You say that every business, even a smallest startup, should consider launching a podcast. Why don't you fill in those blanks for me? Maybe even when there isn't someone who should be perfect. Go for it.
Well, again, I'll go back to my sales background because I remember making, dozens of phone calls just to try and get one sort of sales appointment. And I have friends in the, in the real estate space where that's their entire day is they're just calling people just to get their foot in the door because they know if they can get their foot in the door with X amount of people, that's going to turn into X amount of business. And so when all of a sudden, I started a podcast, I realized that if I invited someone onto my show or if I sent my show to somebody, that was a much more receptive offer than, "Hey, can we meet for 15 minutes to chat so I can tell you about my business?" And obviously there are wrong ways to do it and there are right ways to do it. But again, I go back to high school. I was sort of back then still the nerdy kid. And so I realized that if me and my friend threw the parties, we could make more friends because it was easier to get, all the pretty girls that come over to your party as opposed to trying to get invited to the ones that they were at. And so it's sort of the same mindset where if you have something to invite them to, now all of a sudden you create a value add for your guest, both in the opportunity, the placement, the distribution. Maybe there's some prestige and some esteem that maybe gets associated with it as well. But it really creates these connections that are otherwise going to take you years to get, a lot of dollars to get, or are just frankly not possible without something like a podcast.
When you're working with a business and they say, listen, I want to do a podcast, how do you figure the right tempo? Because, Wayne and I were 400 podcasts deep in. We book an hour with somebody. I mean, I do my production too, but let's say, you're doing the production for them. So that takes the weight off the shoulders, for labor, and you're tweaking everything for them and do the intros, the outros, yada, yada, yada. How do you shape it so that it's kind of the right length? I book an hour, but the output might be anywhere from 25 to 45 minutes, depending on the guest and what, or I might have to do iteration two because there's too much to take in one shot. Do you kind of wrap it around going, you're this is the information you're going to share. I'm going to stop talking because you know what? I'm going to let you fill the blanks in.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question and something that people always have. And I always go back to the listener. Recently, I had someone reach out to me and they said, "Oh, I love your podcast because, certain show is all under 30 minutes." And they're like, "I'm at the gym. That's what I'm looking for. I need it to be under 30 minutes. And that's the show that I'm looking for." So they're looking to something to place into that sort of that time bucket. And you can sort of expand that to a couple of other ones. A lot of them are like drive time or commute, which is like 30 to 45 minutes. Workouts might be a little bit longer. But I would think about it as when is your listener most apt to listen to it? And it's probably on most people, it's on some sort of a commute or some sort of activity. And the thing about that is they like to complete the cycle. And so it's important to sort of think about those. We have one show in particular that they like to have really in-depth interviews. And so we'll just break them up into multiple chunks and it'll be part one and part two. And, we can do some things to smooth that over and make that sort of a smoother listening experience. But I think it's important to think about what your listeners are doing and also realize that you're probably not like a Joe. People always point to, well, Joe Rogan has 3 hour, podcasts. And it's like, well, you're not selling tickets to a comedy show. You're not selling sponsorship. There's a totally different business model for what they're doing. And I think that has to that should be something to be considered for business owners who are using this as a medium to grow their business.
You also wrap up at the same time because there's a sound bite in doing a podcast, but we also have YouTube podcasts going out, so there's a visual in there. Do you post on both spectrums, and how do you take the content? Then do you take chunks of the content out for promotional pieces?
Yeah, all of it. The reality of podcasts is that most of the benefit of having a podcast is actually not from specifically the podcast listeners. And when I say that, I mean people who are specifically downloading it on Apple and Spotify, right? Because, YouTube is this sort of this weird gray area where, is it a podcast? Is it a not? And I don't really care to debate about that because it's really about being top of mind. It's really about being awareness. We had a show that started it. And similarly, they were an agency, a service provider in a particular industry, in a really niche industry that was well funded, though. And so within about a year and a half, they were able to become like the premier service provider in that industry simply because they were the ones creating content around it every week. And so they had this platform to be sharing what was going on within the industry, but then they also had this opportunity to be connecting with all of the top players in that industry and be having the conversation where they just got back from a conference, and it turns out that, one of the, top, I guess, probably top 3 biggest companies in the world are listening to this show because they became the show in that industry. And that, that industry is someone that's very interested in these particular companies and sorts. And so in a very small matter of time, were they able to do that? And also, so it's not about necessarily the number of it, but those people are not necessarily just finding it through Apple and Spotify. They're seeing it on LinkedIn. They're catching a clip here. Maybe they're seeing, maybe if your industry or your niche is on, TikTok or Instagram, or that's where they're looking for your type of content. Those places are all great places to find them and do just as great of a job in terms of staying top of mind and building that trust really with your client. That if you're in an industry that trust takes time, it's oftentimes just as good as having a 15-minute phone call with them to check in and see how their family's doing and all that sort of stuff that you used to have to do before the internet and social media provide these opportunities. And so just focusing on the listeners is sort of a myopic. It's not a great metric to show the actual impact or reach. It's hard, and people are trying to do it, but no one's really done a great job of it yet.
What happens when someone they say, I've been told you can help me with a podcast. And you go, of course I can. That's what I do. And 3 sentences in that he or she, I'm afraid it's usually he in this case, doesn't have a clear understanding of what the benefits might be. And he has this feeling that if he does 5 podcasts, he's going to be Joe Rogan. How do you ground him? And when do you do it, if at all?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I would imagine that a lot of, we do have a lot of guys and women who come to us, but there's something to the esteem that comes with having a podcast. And I would liken it to the same sort of esteem that maybe 10 years ago was around writing a book. And I think that is sort of, maybe with AI, it's sort of lost its luster a little bit. 10 years ago, if you wrote a book, there was this, whoa, you're an author. Like that is awesome. 20 years ago, it was even more impressive because, there was an ability to, before self-publishing. But now there is this, this vanity thing that can't frankly be separated from it. And I think that it also is important and an important part of it, because usually what I found is underneath is that they have a message that they want to share. And they have something important that they want to say, that they want to teach, that they want to inform or educate or inspire, that there's something worth saying, and that deep down in their heart of hearts, they're like, you're not saying what you're meant to be saying. Not to get biblical or spiritual. There's a quote that is apparently been attributed to Timothy that says like something to the fact of what you bring forth will save you, and what you keep in will destroy you. And you can take the spiritual, the religious out of it. Things that we share, if there's all this experience, all this knowledge, decades of wisdom that's been accrued, I can't imagine how much of that has just been lost because someone didn't share it. Didn't maybe they did share it in a conversation with somebody, but then it was lost after that conversation, or maybe it was passed down to that. What's beautiful about podcasts is you have sort of this living record of these sort of things that really can ultimately be a legacy that people leave on, far past themselves. And so we try and find like what is really underneath this vanity, because underneath that is usually something that's more purposeful, we'll say.
Something that I think is interesting, that is still unfolding, if you're a certain age, let's say 50 or above, you were trained by broadcasting. And then this podcasting community came along. It was basically narrowcasting, so that you knew exactly that your guest was left-handed, red-haired. His left foot was bigger than his right foot, and only wore. Yeah. How do you help craft the podcaster to find his or her audience that is his or her audience, if at all?
One of the things that we have a three-part system when we're sort of helping people to discover like what's the premise of their show, right? And I think that this is really what we help them define is what's their perspective, right? Usually it's sort of what is what's unique about them, right? What is their unique experience, or maybe they have a unique skill set, or usually it's that they have a unique personality. I think, you talk about broadcasting. One of the things that they did really well was they had, they really had people lean into their characters, and you would talk to some of these people who worked in it, and they would have tidbits of that character in them, but their on air persona was different than, or was a little different than their regular person or the regular personality. And I think that in a similar way, business leaders can lean into that. We have one show that is in a very dry, boring niche, and some of the times our editors are like, we don't even know what they're talking about here because some of it's so in depth and technical. And we find that one of the hosts, one of the leaders of that company, he's tell him to do it. He's very funny. He's prickly. He's sassy. He's sarcastic. He sort of plays up that character because it sort of brings some comic relief to the otherwise sort of dry, nature of it. And so I think that the challenge really is taking these people who have been, career business executives, and then to your point, turning them into broadcast, what were otherwise broadcasters, and giving them media training or making them comfortable on the mic is its own journey in and of itself. So once they've got over the hurdle of doing that, that is something that usually we find it takes about 50 episodes to kind of get their bearings.
Loosen them up. So this kind of then speaks like someone says, listen, I want to do a show. I want to do a podcast. Maybe 10 start out with. And much like we've talked to people that have done books in the past that help you write a book, etc. There's a whole, so the persona you speak of, it comes into play. The book cover comes into play. So there's artwork that gets spun into this. There's also the soundbite in the background, a little jingle. There's a certain insurance companies or certain hamburger joints. You hear that, exactly tag, that's where I'm going for my burger, even though it may not be good for you. Do you build that out around them too? Do you build out the artwork, the look, almost like getting coiffed, styled, the stage?
Yeah, and it is. Yes, we do it, and we've had to build out and layer on, the vertical integration. We started out, thankfully, as a podcast promotion company and sort of backed our way into doing all of the production and show development as well. But I think that that's a really good point about a podcast, that especially as we move forward, it takes a lot of different pieces, or it takes a lot of different skill sets to produce it in a way that most people want to do it. You do need a video editor, you need a graphic designer, you need an audio person, you need someone now to know how to record, or even more and more to like make a set and make it look good. And more and more people are wanting to do things in studio, and so it's becoming a more and more of a production. And I think that people should also understand that reality too, because that's really hard to do alone, which used to be always the draw, is that you could do the podcast sort of by yourself. And I mean, you definitely can, but I don't know that I would recommend that necessarily.
It might take more than 50 shows. Sorry, experience.
Some industries may be more easy led into this, and maybe some less so. Do you have any industries that are better at using podcasts, or it's a more natural fit to do a podcast than others?
Yeah, we find that podcasts work really well in high trust service-based industries. When you think about healthcare, even legal, accounting, consulting, these places where almost the service is commoditized in the sense of who does your accounting or who is your financial advisor. The actual service that they're providing is sort of commoditized. The difference lies in them, in the trust that you have with them, the relationship that you have with them, the alignment that you have with them. And so if there are industries like that where the only thing that separates you from your competitors is who you are, those are sort of the best industries. Where it gets a little challenging is in low margin, high volume industries where you need to sell a lot of products and you need to sell a lot of units and you need to sell a lot. That becomes tricky because yes, there are ways to do mass advertising via podcasts. The infrastructure is not as easy as hopping on and doing Facebook ads or hopping on and doing a Google or YouTube ad. And so it becomes a lot more time intensive, and thus it takes a lot of work. And then to that point, if you need your show to reach a large audience, that's going to take more money. And so to summarize and make it simpler, if you need one out of 100 to do, for your business to do great, and that way you can get 5, 10, 15 new clients, that's going to change your world, then a podcast is going to be great. But if you need 15,000 customers this quarter, perhaps there's a different strategy.
I find interesting about the industry is the graveyard of the abandoned podcasts. What's your take on abandoned podcasts, and how do you like to help your clients avoid them, and why do you think they're even there?
It's hard to do a podcast on your own, and it is hard to do a podcast. So that's what I'd say initially. Most people, they get into it and they realize that it's a lot more work than they realized. And so that we can't get around that, that it is a hard thing to do if you're trying to do it all on your own. One of the reasons that we have a job is that we do everything so that way our clients, all they have to do is come in and talk, and a lot of them, they like talking, they like having conversations, they like connecting with really smart people. And so for them to show up once an hour and to talk with someone really smart, ask them questions, create a business development, create a business relationship that, aids in business development, they can do all that in an hour. And then we can also put it on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, get it in all these different places. They're like, wow, that hour was really worth it to me. But if all of a sudden they have to go in and they have to record it, and then they have to edit it, and they have to turn it into a video, and they have to create a graphic, and they have to write a summary, and they have to put it in all these different places, and they have to chop it up. Like, if they do all that, it's not worth it to them. They should be spending the time on their actual business. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is we've had shows though that even, we've come in and try and save a sinking ship, and, they're 3-4 years in. And what happens is that the show, and I'm speaking specifically about shows that were started, in accordance or in alignment with the business, have gone so far away from the business, or their show's interests and the business interests are so far away that they don't even know why they're doing the show anymore. We had one show that was doing tens of thousands of downloads, on a weekly basis, hundreds of thousands on a monthly basis. And the number one question that we were asking in the meeting is like, why are we doing the show? And it was like, well, the business couldn't find the way to fit the show into the business, and for a variety of reasons. But that's also really important for businesses to think about on the onset, is like, how do we build these things in parallel? So that way it is not like two separate entities, and that one entity takes resources and pulls those resources away from another. It should actually be that one entity, you pour resources into one, and it actually feeds and drives the other one, in some sort of circuitous or like waterfall like manner. And a lot of businesses miss that, or they lose it over time because they just get in the rut or the habit of doing show after show, and they kind of lose that over time.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, and I get what you're saying. It's two ships passing the night. The further you go, the farther apart they are. In a circumstance where you're having that type of situation, the podcast is strong, it's healthy, it's got a lot of listeners, a lot of engagement, but the business is going, that ain't us anymore. How do you get a feedback loops from either your customer base or your audience base to see, are we tracking? Or not even if we're tracking, is something shifting in the market? Because, hairstyles, for example, have changed over the last 100 years, from what I understand. You know, high and tight to, long flowing from the 60s. Wayne and I are still from that era to, it's a mixed bag to mohawks, depending on the years 2000, right, during the punk rock scene. So things shift around. How do you get a sense? Obviously, the strong indicators, either you're increasing audience or it's diminishing. But is there anything else you use? Any other tools you use to leverage to go where are we at?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I remember I'm glad I could do it when I was, grown because I tell my barber that I want a modern mullet. And if I told my mom, growing up that I was ever going to have a mullet, should have shaved my head immediately. Uh, that would not been allowed in her in her house. To answer your question though, one thing that we did with one of our shows that worked really well, and obviously it requires a like you said, an audience that's already there. But if there is an audience there, we like to ask them. And so we had a survey, and we would mention it on every show. At the end, we'd say like, hey, if you'd love to give your feedback, and we had different contests and we had different prizes that we would announce, but we would just go through those responses, and we would say, what are you into? What do you not like? What do you like? What could we add? Who do you want to, basic sort of stuff. And that was very qualitative, sort of what we were looking for is qualitative stuff. And we got a lot of great episode topics there. We got a lot of great guest recommendations there and just direct feedback in their words. And so that's also a really cool way that you can start to identify some super fans and some people who can really become this inner circle of community. Because I think that's the next step, is that once you've established a host to listener connection, can you create a listener to listener connection? And then that starts to grow and build when you're not even there.
So, Hector, this is fuel for a whole other podcast or a one sentence answer. Have you ever had someone who started a podcast because they felt called, A, really enjoyed it, B, got really good at it, and got so good at it, they sold their business and became a full time podcaster?
That pregnant pause is indicating not many.
No, I've only seen it the other way. I've only seen
Okay.
people sell their business and then start a podcast. That tends to be it tends to be one of those life finding moments. But no, I don't think it is a great business model on its own. It's actually a terrible business model inherent, like in and of itself. To like the media business model specifically via podcasting is terrible. YouTube a little bit better, but even then, I think what people don't realize is that you're looking at these YouTubers and you're still in the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. Whereas what we're talking about is taking your current business and helping you get 5, 10, 15, 20 more clients this quarter. That I think is sort of, maybe we should pare people's expectations down, that like, no, we don't, our goal is not to make you like Gwen Stefani of, of the 2025. Like we're not here to make you some celebrity necessarily. It is a byproduct sometimes. We're here to like grow your business. We're here to drive business. And if that's why you want to do it, like that's a great reason to start a podcast, not because you want to be famous.
You mean Bernie lied to me? Sorry, that was just an attempt at humor.
I'm just as you after you said that, I'm going to put sequins on you, see what happens next. And no, we're not going to do that for all of our sakes. When you're crafting a story or a podcast, so what we've learned early on through our evolution is to have some structure to come into it. And there's usually a script to work from. It's just something. It depends on your guests, or it depends on the type of show you're doing. Whether you're interviewing somebody, whether you're just expressing content as a subject matter expert, and maybe it's hot button stuff, it's talking about tariffs, or it's talking about housing, whatever the case might be, or versus having a round table with a group of people. How do you set up that structure? Is it totally dependent on the type of podcast? Is it dependent on the type of industry? What?
Yeah, definitely think it does depend on the type of podcast, type of industry. Like we have to take a lot of the comedy podcasts and a lot of the ones that are the most popular shows are exactly what you said. People sit around a table and they talk nonsense for 3 hours. And that works because that's sort of what people are looking for when they listen to those shows. They're looking to check out. They're looking to just hang out and goof around with their friends, and that's sort of the objective that they're looking to get. Most of the time, when someone is listening to a podcast, at least of what we're talking about, they're looking to get some sort of outcome out of it. They're looking for the resolution to some sort of problem. And so I think that structuring it is so that they get that outcome is very, very important. And that can be done through an interview. That can be done even just solo episodes. I think the more people that you add into the episode, the more skillful the host has to be in terms of navigating that dynamic between everybody. 2 is much easier than 3. 4 is really, really challenging, and upwards of there is even more challenging in terms of getting everybody's chance to be able to take place, pardon it, and then also for it to not go off the rails, right? And for you to not, end up in some rabbit hole or end up way off track. Because I do think that there should be, even if even if it doesn't follow a linear path, we talk about like a spider web sort of analogy with our hosts, where you have a central point and you might branch out, but it should come back to that central point, and then you can branch out again and come back to it. That way, at least the listeners at the end, they feel whole or complete, as opposed to getting to the end of it and sort of feeling rattled and discombobulated, if you will.
It almost reminds me of just having there are different talk shows, and the one that is out of BBC out of the UK, right? And it's a Graham Norton show, and I just watch how because he'll have 5 or 6 guests, and they'll roll in. So there's a whole structure point to that. So would you take your role models for, although Graham is doing it he's talking to other stars, etc. Would you use that as a role model for how to manage those type of things as kind of a rule of thumb? So use the live examples that's actually out in the entertainment industry?
I mean, for sure. I think one thing that can be brought over more from broadcasting in general is the idea of segments and having some sort of script. I think a lot of podcasters they get away with not having a script and not having a structure because I can just hit record and great. And sure you can, but I think that also puts a ceiling on your show to an extent. And of course, people are going to point to the examples of all the shows that don't, have any structure, and also the audience that they've had and the amount of episodes that they've done. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration. But the more that you can create some sort of repeatable and something that is expected, I think, is what I'm looking for. The Simpsons did a great job with it. When in their intro, growing up, I would watch I would only get to watch the intro because my mom would turn it off before the real episode would come on. But I'd at least get to watch the intro, and the whole episode, the Simpsons intro, would be the same, except there would be one little difference at the end where Bart would write, a different message, or something. There would be one little, what do they call those? They're like a little hoodwink in there, right? That you're looking for. And so that's what we try and create for our shows, the things that are almost consistent with a little bit of difference, right? If you can create some consistency and people can start to expect a similar set of questions, or they can start to expect your similar outro or intro. We had a show that would sign off the same way every time. And so we told them, like, keep doing that, like create that repetitiveness is what people start to look forward to. And now you can start to tap into some of these habitual aspects of listenership. So I do think having more segments in there, having repeatable segments, are all really valuable.
One off the wall question, a guest. So this is it. When you have a podcast, you can't open your email without 20 people talking about monetization, monetization, monetization. I think sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. Like, I watch a political podcast who sells men's underwear, and I don't think that's a fit at all. And maybe it's supply chain, maybe it's, when would you say a sponsor is a good, legitimate fit, if ever, in a podcast?
We really, like, again, only focus on niche industry specific shows. And so we generally would say that it makes much more sense for your business to sponsor your show than to come in and have someone else pay for it. With that being said, if your show gets big enough, if it starts to get into the tens of thousands of listeners, it might start to make sense to pursue some of those. I even think that after a while, after you're 50, 100, 150 episodes in, it makes sense to start to pursue some industry like partnerships that may not resemble a typical podcast sponsor where all it is an ad read, or it's an ad read or something like that. But we've had shows where, they don't command the typical monetization prices that a regular, comedy podcast or true crime podcast might. But we created some really cool synergies with custom episodes, and we had a few other people come on, and we created some different outreach and emails, and so we put together this really cool package that made a lot of sense because the audience was aligned, their business was someone that was complementary to the company that was putting on the show. So after a while it starts to make sense if the audience is there. But generally we just try and say, like, how can we get your business making more money? So let's put an ad for your own service in there. Let's create some more opportunities and to direct the listeners into your pipeline or your funnel or wherever it may be. That's usually where we push people first, at least.
Which do you prefer, live or recorded?
I That's a good question. I like live when it's just me, because for some reason, if nobody's on the other side, it's really hard for me to think about what to say. But if I know that people are like watching, or like I'm on, the red dot is on, and I've just got to talk, like I enjoy that pressure, and gives me an opportunity to talk. So I like the opportunity to live stream solo. And then it is I think, much more of a relaxed environment to do interviews recorded.
So if someone is reaching out and they're going, listen, I want to start up, I want to get a sense of it. What type of budget should they kind of squirrel away for, or perhaps take out of their marketing funds?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I go is the 550, 500, 5,000, right? It's like, not the don't start at 5. You can get someone to do it for $50, right? You can get someone to do it for $500, and you can get someone to do it for $5,000. It's like, it's a matter of both your time, how much you want to be spending in it, and how involved you want to get in it. Because there are a lot of podcast editors, and so you can go on a Fiverr, and you can go on and get on an Upwork, and you can find someone who's often very competent and very, very capable of doing a lot of the things that are necessary to launch a podcast. Oftentimes, those people, if they're newer, or excuse me, if it's less expensive, they're either newer, or you're going to do a lot more of the project management, and then it goes up from there. So we're sort of on the higher end of that, excuse me, in terms of those scales, and because our goal is for them to do none of the project management. They don't do any of the they don't do any of the guesswork. They don't have to find any of the contractors. We have all the graphic artists, we have all the audio design people, we have all the music people, and the voiceover artists. So we sort of curate and are more of a concierge. So for people who are, they have more money than time, we're great for them. And for people who have more time than money, there are plenty of people who are willing to do a lot of the bits and pieces that need to get done.
Would you also, and it just popped in my head as you're describing this, would you, like, would studios, because you're out in California, studios reach out to you and then run a podcast as part of their marketing campaign, where the star is talking, and whether you're just hosting it and they're the centerpiece?
We don't produce a lot of those shows that they would be reaching out to. I know they do. I know that podcasts are they are a lot of the marketing, not even just budget, but they're a lot of the marketing direction. But where we see a lot of people is a lot of authors will reach out to us. We see a lot of people who are, they're going on their PR spin. They're trying to make build their personal brand. Podcasts are sort of that great in between. But celebrities are definitely doing it. I mean, you see it all the time. It's the most I don't even like to call them powerful, because I don't think that's the right word for them. The people who are making the decisions at the top of the government global level are trying to get on podcasts. When people are saying that they don't work, I just, I point to what's happening in the world and go, like, these people are trying to get on shows. I'm sure it could help your business in some regard.
You have a certain age, Hector. One thing that I find interesting is we've all watched late night television and have found how to cut a sneaker with a knife that also cuts a tomato, or buy this record from K-Tel. How do you keep it from being an infomercial, or is an infomercial its own legitimate product? Or, I don't want your steak knives. How do you play that game?
Yeah, I think people are looking to be two things that they're looking for. They're looking to be educated or they're looking to be entertained. And so if you can fill into those buckets, that's what you've got to do. Realizing that if you're selling knives, people don't have to spend 45 minutes listening about knives for them to want to buy knives. They might want to listen to, how, the 45 minutes on great, you know, steak, how to cook a steak, right? I don't know, whatever. Like you can go tangential to it, finding things that are around it. And again, I think that like selling knives is probably a really bad example. I did that out of college actually, and so I don't know if I'd start a podcast on how to do that. But in any case, I think that you got to be thinking about the guest, and you also have to realize that they're going to sniff out any sort of snake oil salesman-ish that's there. They're going to sense any misauthenticity. And so if you can't be that, then it's going to be really hard to keep someone around for 45 minutes and then let alone get them to.
Hector, if this rang a bell and we wanted to reach out, how would they do it, and who would be the best fit?
Well, if you have decided that you want to start a podcast but just don't want to deal with any of the headaches that come along with it, and we're the people, you can go to amplafymedia.com. I spell it funny. I started it, like I said, almost a decade ago when it was fun to misspell things. So it's AMPLAFY media.com. And you can go on there and schedule a free podcast planning session where we'll dive in and you'll have a sort of a recipe for what your podcast will look like. And if you think we're a good fit to do it, great. If not, at least you'll you'll have the blueprint to be successful.
Hector, I want to say thank you so much for being on the show today. It's enlightening. It's good to know. I know that both Wayne and I have been in the podcasting space for a while, but it's always good to have insights and see what's out there and how it flows. Well done, by the way. I mean, since 2015, and you're making a living from it. That's outstanding. I also want to say thank you to Wayne Pratt as being a co-host. You, the Knack for Business listeners, if this is like, hey, I need to get a podcast out there, but I don't want to get the training wheels on. I'd rather actually go, hi, here's my steak. Can you please cut it for me because the knives are available? Reach out to Hector, because he's got that piece down pat, and he'll help shape your show, not only from getting it edited, but also everything around it, all the trappings that you need to actually make it successful.
To reach the podcast hosts, email them at info@creativeinsight.com or by the website creativeinsight.com, spelled KREATIVISIGHT.com. To reach Wayne at his email, wayne@motive8u.ca, that is MOTIVE, the numeral 8 and the letter U.ca, or his website, motive8u.ca. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast and share your knowledge, let us know. We would also appreciate your feedback on the content or format. Check the show notes for more details. For these podcasts, we like to acknowledge the support and thanks to the following people. Carl Richards from Podcast Solutions Made Simple, a renowned podcast expert. Fred Crouch, who is the Property Wizard podcaster, where Bernie is a co-host. Jovan Strika from At Hive, a co-working space that is more than just a space. Then Melanie Weber, Bernie's invaluable business partner, and Wayne Pratt from Motive8U Inc., who serves as both a coach and co-host of these podcasts. Disclaimer. Please note that the Knack for Business podcast episodes are meant solely for educational and general informational purposes. The information and opinions contained within are not intended to be professional advice on any subject matter. The thoughts, views, and opinions expressed by the participants are their own personal beliefs and do not represent the views of the podcast hosts or any affiliated organizations. It is important to note that this podcast is not a replacement for consulting with certified experts in your area who possess knowledge of your unique situation. The hosts of the podcast along with any participants or affiliated groups, do not take responsibility for any actions taken or not taken based on the information presented in this episode. It is highly recommended that individuals seek guidance from their own personal advisors in fields such as accounting, law, or other pertinent areas prior to undertaking any actions or making decisions that may impact their financial, legal, or other aspects of life.